Some people think owning land means putting up a fence. My grandfather used to say it means remembering every inch of it by heart. The first shotgun blast echoed across the marsh just as the morning fog began lifting off the water. A second one followed a heartbeat later, then another, each report rolling across the reeds until thousands of resting ducks exploded into the pale October sky. The smell of damp mud mixed with burned gunpowder drifted through the cool air as I stood frozen beside my old aluminum fishing boat, one boot sinking slowly into the black marsh soil that had belonged to my family longer than most of the roads leading to it had even existed. I wasn't supposed to hear gunfire on my property. Not here. Not ever. Yet there they were. Bright camouflage jackets moved between the cattails nearly 300 yards away. 12 airboats and flat-bottom duck boats floated along channels my grandfather had dug by hand decades before I was born. Portable hunting blinds stood where nesting platforms used to protect migrating birds every spring. Labrador retrievers splashed happily through shallow water while someone laughed loud enough to carry across the entire wetland. Then I heard the sentence that made my stomach drop. "Don't worry," a man shouted while loading decoys into the water. The HOA already approved all this. I slowly lowered the binoculars hanging around my neck. My fingers tightened around the worn leather strap until my knuckles turned white. Approved? Approved by who? This wasn't some neighborhood retention pond surrounded by manicured lawns and decorative benches. This was Walker Marsh, nearly 16 square miles of protected wetlands sitting inside the 6,200 acres my grandfather left me when he passed away 6 weeks earlier. Every flooded timber pocket, every hidden slough, every patch of wild rice, and every crooked cypress tree carried decades of family history. I had learned to paddle these waters before I could ride a bicycle. I knew where wood ducks nested, where otters built dens, and where the deepest channels stayed open even during hard freezes. My grandfather used to joke that the marsh knew our family better than most people did. Standing there that morning, watching complete strangers treat it like their private hunting club, I realized someone had convinced an entire neighborhood that my family's land belonged to them. I didn't yell. I didn't wave my arms. I simply watched. Years studying wildlife had taught me something valuable. Animals reveal themselves when they think nobody is paying attention. As it turns out, people aren't much different. One man unfolded a glossy map showing trails that didn't exist. Another pointed toward an old cedar marker that clearly read private property, before casually laughing and pushing it deeper into the mud with his boot. A woman wearing an expensive camouflage jacket lifted her phone and smiled for a group photo beneath one of my grandfather's weathered boundary signs, as if trespassing were just another community event. That's when I understood this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't one careless hunter crossing the wrong fence line. This had been planned, organized, encouraged. Somewhere, someone had told every one of these people they had every right to hunt on my land. What none of them knew was that my grandfather had spent almost 90 years making sure one forgotten piece of paper would guarantee they had absolutely none. My name is Ethan Walker, and until 6 weeks ago, I never imagined that grief could come wrapped inside something as beautiful as sunrise over open water. My grandfather, Harold Walker, passed away at 91 after spending nearly his entire life protecting that marsh from developers, speculators, and anyone else who looked at wetlands and saw empty land instead of living history. At the reading of his will, I learned that everything belonged to me now. 6,200 acres of hardwood forest, native prairie, grazing fields, winding creeks, and the marsh itself stretched farther than the eye could follow from the old observation tower he built in the 1970s. Most people would have seen dollar signs. My grandfather never did. He saw migrating birds arriving every fall exactly when the morning air first smelled like cold water and oak leaves. He saw generations of sandhill cranes returning to the same nesting grounds. He saw children learning that nature only stays wild when someone is willing to leave it alone. I spent my career as a wildlife biologist working with conservation groups across the Midwest, restoring habitats that had already been damaged by poor planning and careless development. Every assignment eventually reminded me of home. Every wetland I visited made me appreciate the one place that had somehow survived almost untouched. When Grandpa called me a year before he died, his voice sounded weaker than I had ever heard it. He only asked for one promise. Do not let anyone convince you this marsh belongs to somebody else. At the time I smiled because the idea seemed ridiculous. The property lines had been surveyed countless times. Weathered cedar posts marked the boundaries. Steel monuments sat buried beneath the soil. The county records dated back generations. Who would honestly argue otherwise? Then Willow Creek Estates appeared less than 2 years earlier. Hundreds of large homes rose where soybean fields used to stretch across the horizon. Neatly paved streets replaced gravel roads. Decorative stone entrances welcomed newcomers with polished signs promising luxury, living beside untouched natural beauty. I noticed that phrase the very first time I drove past the entrance after Grandpa's funeral. Beside the artist's rendering of the neighborhood stood a watercolor painting that looked strangely familiar. A winding marsh, tall reeds, cypress trees, even the old wooden duck blind my grandfather built with his father decades earlier. They were advertising my family's marsh as if it were part of the community scenery. I remember slowing my truck almost to a stop while staring at the sign through the windshield. Something about it did not sit right with me, but I convinced myself it was only creative marketing. After all, people could paint landscapes without owning them. Looking back now, I realized that was the first warning I ignored. The second came 3 days later when I found fresh tire tracks crossing an old maintenance trail that had been locked for years. I blamed curious fishermen. The third warning was the empty coffee cups left beside one of the observation platforms. I blamed careless visitors. Standing there after hearing those shotgun blasts echo across the marsh, every small detail suddenly fit together like pieces of a puzzle my grandfather had tried to prepare me for long before I was ready to see it. The next morning I drove into Willow Creek Estates instead of heading back to the marsh. If someone believed they had permission to hunt on my land, I wanted to know who had convinced them. The neighborhood looked exactly like every glossy brochure promising peaceful country living. Fresh sod covered every front yard. Young maple trees lined the sidewalks. Decorative street lamps stood beside ponds that were barely a few feet deep but were already advertised as scenic lakes. Everything looked carefully designed to feel established, even though most of the homes had been built within the last 2 years. Near the entrance stood the community clubhouse, a stone building with white columns and oversized windows overlooking a manicured lawn. Parked outside were golf carts, luxury pickup trucks, and a large sport utility vehicle with a license plate frame that read Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Inside, cheerful music played softly while residents gathered around coffee and pastries. Mounted on one wall hung another oversized map of the neighborhood. My eyes immediately drifted beyond the final row of houses. There it was again, my family's marsh. It had been shaded in green and labeled Community Nature Preserve and Seasonal Recreation Area. There was no property line, no ownership boundary, no indication that every acre beyond the subdivision belonged to someone else. Before I could study it any longer, a confident voice greeted me from behind. "You must be new around here." I turned to see a woman in her early 50s wearing a tailored blazer with a name badge that read Linda Prescott, President. Her smile looked polished enough to belong in a real estate commercial. She extended her hand before introducing herself as though she had rehearsed the gesture thousands of times. I shook her hand and introduced myself simply as Ethan Walker. The moment she heard my last name, something almost invisible crossed her face before the smile quickly returned. It lasted less than a second, but I noticed it. Years of observing wildlife had trained me to catch subtle changes most people ignored. "Walker," she repeated slowly. "As in the old property next door?" I nodded. "Actually, the property is mine now." She laughed softly, not in surprise, but in a way that suggested she already expected that answer. "Well, congratulations. That is certainly a lot of land for one person." I thanked her without offering anything more. She gestured toward the map with practiced confidence. "Our residents absolutely love having access to the natural surroundings. It was one of the biggest selling points for the neighborhood." I looked directly at the section showing the marsh. "Access?" I asked. "Of course," she replied. "Everyone enjoys walking, bird watching, kayaking, and during waterfowl season some families have traditional hunting outings. We have always considered it part of the community experience." Her words landed harder than I expected because she spoke them with complete certainty. There was no hesitation, no apology, no sign that she believed anything she described might be inappropriate. To her, The marsh had already become an amenity listed alongside walking trails and picnic areas. I kept my voice calm. Did someone tell you that land belongs to the association? Linda folded her arms and smiled again. Only this time it felt less welcoming. Let us just say our attorneys reviewed everything years ago. We are very comfortable with our position. That single sentence explained far more than she intended. She was not guessing. She believed paperwork existed somewhere to support a claim that should never have existed in the first place. And suddenly my grandfather's final warning no longer sounded like the fading concern of an old man. It sounded like preparation for a battle he knew would eventually become mine. I left the clubhouse without arguing because I had already learned something far more valuable than winning a conversation. Linda believed her own story, and people who truly believe they are right rarely hide what they are doing. Over the next 2 weeks, I stopped making assumptions and started paying attention. Every sunrise revealed another small change across the marsh. Fresh kayak tracks carved through shallow channels that only my grandfather and I had ever used. Bright orange survey flags appeared beside trails that had never been part of any public map. Someone even trimmed low-hanging willow branches to widen a narrow water passage that naturally discouraged boat traffic. None of it happened overnight. It happened one careful step at a time, almost politely, as though each small intrusion would become invisible once the next one appeared. One Saturday morning, I watched families unload coolers, folding chairs, fishing poles, and binoculars from their vehicles at the old gravel road leading toward my western boundary. Children laughed while parents pointed toward the water and described it as their neighborhood marsh. Nobody looked nervous. Nobody acted like they were crossing onto private property. They honestly believed they had been invited. The realization frustrated me more than the trespassing itself because most of these people were not trying to cause trouble. They had trusted the information given to them. The real problem sat somewhere much higher. A few days later, I noticed a brand new wooden sign fastened to two-seater posts just outside one of my fence lines. The lettering was professionally painted. It read Community Wildlife Access. An arrow pointed directly toward one of my oldest duck blinds. There was no logo from the county, no state park emblem, just the association name printed neatly across the bottom. I photographed the sign before walking farther down the trail. What I found next stopped me in my tracks. Someone had installed a metal rack holding laminated trail maps inside weatherproof plastic sleeves. Curious visitors could remove a map, follow highlighted routes through my marsh, then return it before leaving. Every trail was marked with cheerful symbols for bird watching, photography, kayaking, and seasonal hunting. The map even included estimated walking times, as though generations of careful land stewardship had somehow become another neighborhood convenience. I unfolded one of the maps and studied every detail. Several routes crossed property lines that had never changed in nearly 90 years. One highlighted path passed directly through a protected nesting area that remained closed every spring to avoid disturbing migratory birds. Another route ended at the observation platform where my grandfather had taught me to identify waterfowl before I was old enough to drive. Someone had transformed deeply personal family landmarks into recreational attractions without asking a single question. That evening, I drove slowly around Willow Creek Estates again. Near the clubhouse entrance, a large banner advertised the upcoming Autumn Outdoor Festival. Below the smiling photographs of families roasting marshmallows and paddling canoes was a schedule of activities. Guided nature walk, community bird watching, marsh photography contest, sunrise waterfowl hunt. I read those last 3 words twice before quietly folding the brochure and placing it inside my truck. They were no longer pretending the marsh simply bordered the neighborhood. They were organizing official events on land they did not own, printing schedules, distributing maps, installing signs, and encouraging hundreds of residents to believe it was all perfectly legitimate. Standing there beneath the fading evening light, I finally understood that this had grown far beyond a property dispute. Someone had spent years rewriting reality, and an entire community had accepted the new version without ever questioning where the truth actually began. For the first time since inheriting the property, I started wondering if I was already too late. Every morning seemed to erase another piece of the quiet world my grandfather had protected for almost a century. The marsh still smelled like wet earth and wild rice after sunrise, and great blue herons still stood perfectly still along the shallow banks. But the silence had changed. Instead of hearing only wind moving through the reeds, I heard car doors closing on the access road, cheerful conversations drifting across the water, and portable speakers playing music during weekend outings. The land had not physically disappeared, yet it somehow felt less like home every single day. I decided it was time to stop observing and start asking questions through the proper channels. My first visit was to the county sheriff's office. I explained that organized groups were entering clearly marked private property without permission, carrying printed maps that encouraged residents to use the marsh for recreation. The deputy listened politely, nodded several times, then leaned back in his chair with an expression that suggested he had already heard similar complaints. He explained that property boundary disagreements between landowners and homeowner associations were usually considered civil matters unless there was immediate danger or intentional property damage. He recommended documenting everything and speaking with an attorney before requesting further assistance. It was not the answer I hoped for, but I thanked him anyway. The following afternoon, I drove to the county planning department carrying copies of my property survey, tax records, and aerial photographs. An employee searched through digital maps for nearly 20 minutes before quietly admitting that every official county record still showed the marsh entirely inside the Walker property. Nothing in the public files transferred ownership, granted recreational access, or created any public easement. That should have reassured me, yet it only made the situation stranger. If the county records were correct, how had an entire neighborhood become convinced otherwise? I scheduled a meeting with a local attorney who specialized in real estate disputes. After reviewing my documents, he looked across the desk and sighed. He told me that homeowner associations often became expensive opponents because they could spread legal costs across hundreds of residents. He suggested negotiating a shared access agreement instead of pursuing a lengthy conflict. I stared at him for several seconds before asking the only question that mattered. Would you recommend sharing your own backyard with strangers if they simply decided they deserved it? He smiled awkwardly but never answered. I walked out carrying the same folder I had brought in, feeling more isolated than when I arrived. That evening, I returned to the old farmhouse where my grandfather had lived for nearly 70 years. The familiar smell of cedar, coffee, and aging books greeted me the moment I opened the front door. Everything remained exactly where he had left it. His reading glasses rested beside an unfinished crossword puzzle. His old field notebook still lay open on the kitchen table with observations about migrating ducks written in careful block letters. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, I sat alone in the quiet house listening to the grandfather clock mark every passing minute. For the first time since his funeral, I found myself wondering whether he had anticipated every obstacle standing in front of me. He had never been a man who worried without preparing. If he believed someone would eventually challenge our family's ownership, then somewhere inside this house he had almost certainly left more than memories behind, and deep down I could not shake the feeling that the answer had been waiting here all along. I started searching the farmhouse the same way my grandfather had taught me to track wildlife, slowly, methodically, and without assuming I already knew where the answer would be. Every cabinet, every drawer, every shelf held another piece of his life. Old photographs showed flooded timber from the 1950s before the surrounding farmland had even been cleared. Leather journals described rainfall, migration dates, and water levels with remarkable precision. Hand-drawn maps filled entire folders, each one updated over decades in different shades of ink as the marsh naturally changed with the seasons. Hours passed before I finally climbed the narrow staircase leading to the attic. Dust floated through thin beams of afternoon sunlight as I pushed aside old fishing rods, wooden decoys, and boxes labeled with years stretching back further than I had been alive. Against the far wall sat a heavy cedar chest I had not opened since I was a teenager. Inside were military medals belonging to my great-grandfather, family letters, and beneath a folded wool blanket rested a small steel lockbox. I immediately recognized it. My grandfather kept the key on the same brass ring as the tractor keys he carried every day. After a few minutes of searching downstairs, I found them hanging exactly where he always left them beside the mudroom door. The lock clicked open with surprising ease. Inside lay neatly organized folders protected inside waterproof sleeves. The first document was the original property survey completed in 1937, complete with embossed seals and handwritten notes from the county surveyor. The second folder contained every updated boundary certification performed over the next 8 decades. None of the lines had ever changed. The third folder caught my attention even more. Across the front, my grandfather had written in thick black marker, "Read this first if anyone challenges the Marsh." My heartbeat quickened as I opened it. Inside was a detailed letter addressed to me years before he passed away. He explained that developers had approached him more than once with proposals to purchase portions of the wetlands. But he refused every offer because the marsh was protected under several conservation agreements created with state and federal wildlife agencies. He warned that future subdivisions might try to market the scenery without understanding the legal restrictions surrounding it. Attached behind the letter were certified copies of conservation easements, habitat management agreements, wetland registration records, and a document I had never seen before. Its title immediately stood out: Exclusive Waterfowl Management and Hunting Rights Agreement. The agreement clearly stated that all hunting activity required written authorization from the property owner and had to comply with the habitat management plan established decades earlier. Unauthorized organized hunting events violated both private property rights and active conservation commitments. My grandfather had highlighted one paragraph in yellow. Beside it, he wrote only 5 words in careful handwriting: "They cannot claim ignorance forever." At the bottom of the folder rested another envelope labeled Current Contacts. Inside were business cards from the Regional Conservation Office, licensed surveyors, environmental attorneys, and a state game warden named Daniel Brooks. Every card included handwritten notes describing previous conversations and dates. It suddenly became obvious that my grandfather had never expected me to win this battle by raising my voice. He expected me to win it by knowing exactly which documents mattered, exactly which agencies had authority, and exactly when to let the facts speak louder than anyone's confidence. As I carefully returned every paper to its protective sleeve, I realized the marsh had been defending itself long before I inherited it. My grandfather had simply spent decades making sure the truth would survive long enough for me to find it. The next morning, I called every number my grandfather had placed inside that envelope, beginning with the one written in blue ink beside Daniel Brooks. He answered on the second ring, and before I could finish introducing myself, he interrupted with a quiet laugh. "You are Harold Walker's grandson, aren't you?" I admitted that I was, and he told me he had been expecting my call someday, although he had hoped it would come much later. We met that afternoon at a small county office overlooking a reservoir several miles from the marsh. Daniel was nothing like the loud television personalities people imagined when they heard the words game warden. He spoke calmly, listened carefully, and spent nearly an hour reading every document my grandfather had preserved. He never rushed through a single page. Occasionally he nodded, circled a paragraph with his finger, or compared one survey to another. When he finally leaned back in his chair, he looked at me and said something I had not heard from anyone else since this nightmare began. "Your grandfather documented everything exactly the way I would have advised him." Those words alone lifted a weight from my shoulders. Daniel explained that property ownership, conservation agreements, and wildlife regulations often overlapped, but together they created a clear picture. If organized activities were taking place without the landowner's permission inside protected habitat, multiple agencies could become involved, each responsible for a different part of the situation. The important thing, he reminded me, was patience. Evidence gathered correctly always carried more weight than accusations made too early. That afternoon, I stopped thinking about confrontation and started thinking about documentation. I hired a licensed survey company to verify every boundary marker surrounding the marsh. Bright orange reference stakes appeared beside the original cedar posts without disturbing the protected habitat. I installed discrete trail cameras overlooking existing access points instead of hiding them in random locations. Each camera recorded the date, time, and location automatically. I photographed every unauthorized sign, every printed trail map, and every temporary structure that appeared along the shoreline. I even kept copies of community newsletters announcing outdoor events connected to the marsh. Everything went into neatly labeled folders, just as my grandfather would have done. Meanwhile, Willow Creek Estates grew even more confident. New social media posts celebrated upcoming outdoor weekends besides smiling families posing with kayaks and binoculars. The association newsletter announced its largest autumn outdoor festival yet, encouraging residents to invite relatives and friends from neighboring counties. The schedule proudly listed guided hikes, sunrise photography, educational nature tours, and another organized waterfowl outing. Reading those announcements no longer filled me with frustration. They were creating their own timeline, publishing it in writing, and distributing it to hundreds of people. Daniel reviewed every brochure I forwarded to him without offering dramatic reactions. His replies remained simple. Keep everything. Do not remove their signs. Do not argue with participants. Let the records grow. At first, that advice felt almost passive, but gradually I understood the strategy. Every additional map, every advertisement, every photograph, and every organized event strengthened the factual record. The truth was no longer resting only inside my grandfather's lockbox. It was unfolding in real time, documented by the very people convinced they had nothing to hide. As another crisp autumn sunrise reflected across the still water, I stood beside one of the original cedar boundary posts and noticed something I had not seen before. Someone had tied colorful ribbons to the weathered wood and attached a laminated welcome sign inviting festival guests to gather there the following Saturday morning. They had unknowingly chosen the exact spot where the original survey monument rested beneath the soil, the same monument that had defined my family's property line for nearly 90 years, and for the first time since this all began, I quietly smiled. Saturday arrived wrapped in a cold layer of silver fog that drifted slowly across the marsh until the first rays of sunlight turned the water into polished glass. From my position inside the old observation tower, I could hear engines long before I saw them. Pickup trucks lined the gravel road exactly where the community newsletter had instructed guests to park. Families stepped out carrying cameras, folding chairs, coffee mugs, binoculars, and outdoor gear, while volunteers wearing matching Willow Creek Estates shirts welcomed everyone with bright smiles and printed schedules. The colorful ribbons tied to my grandfather's cedar boundary post fluttered gently in the morning breeze as though they had always belonged there. Linda Prescott stood beside the temporary welcome table greeting residents one by one, pointing proudly toward the marsh behind her. She looked completely comfortable, speaking with the confidence of someone introducing visitors to property she believed the association controlled. I remained exactly where Daniel Brooks had asked me to stay, watching quietly without interrupting a single person. Every trail camera continued recording. Every boundary marker remained untouched. Every printed brochure had already been preserved inside my files. At precisely 8 o'clock, the guided nature walk began. Small groups followed volunteer leaders carrying laminated maps identical to the ones I had photographed weeks earlier. Another group prepared kayaks near the Western Channel. Several photographers gathered around the old observation platform while discussing the best angle for sunrise reflections. Everything unfolded exactly as the published schedule described. Then, just as the first organized hunting group prepared to move farther into the protected wetlands, a line of county vehicles appeared on the access road. They arrived without flashing lights, without raised voices, and without creating unnecessary alarm. Daniel stepped out first, followed by representatives from the county survey office, the regional conservation agency, and additional officials responsible for wildlife management. Their calm professionalism immediately changed the atmosphere. Conversations grew quieter as survey crews unpacked precision equipment and walked directly toward the original monument buried beneath the cedar boundary marker. Within minutes, they confirmed the historic property line using both the original 1937 survey and modern satellite positioning equipment. Every highlighted trail on the association maps crossed private property exactly where my grandfather's records said they would. Daniel spoke respectfully with participants, explaining that the marsh remained privately owned and protected under long-standing conservation agreements. Most residents looked genuinely surprised. Several immediately folded their maps and asked questions about how they had received incorrect information. Parents gathered their children without complaint. Visiting photographers quietly packed their equipment. The confusion on their faces made it obvious that many had simply trusted what they had been told for years. Linda, however, remained unusually confident until county officials unfolded enlarged copies of the certified surveys beside the original conservation documents my grandfather had preserved. One page after another matched perfectly. Property boundaries, habitat agreements, Exclusive management rights. Historical records. Every document supported the next. The story she had repeated so confidently slowly unraveled beneath the weight of official records that had existed decades before Willow Creek Estates had ever been imagined. By late morning, the temporary welcome signs were carefully removed. The community trail maps were collected, and officials informed the association that future organized activities inside the marsh could not continue without the property owner's authorization and full compliance with applicable conservation requirements. Nobody argued loudly. Nobody caused a scene. The truth simply occupied the space where assumptions had lived for far too long. As I watched workers carry away the last laminated map from the old cedar post, I remembered the sentence my grandfather had written beside the highlighted paragraph inside his lockbox. They cannot claim ignorance forever. Standing there in the crisp autumn air, I finally understood that he had never been predicting revenge. He had been describing the quiet moment when facts would become impossible for anyone to ignore. A full year has passed since that quiet autumn morning, and the marsh feels like it can finally breathe again. Dawn arrives the way I remember from childhood, carrying the scent of fresh water, wild grass, and fallen oak leaves instead of vehicle exhaust and crowded weekend gatherings. The only sounds that break the silence now are the soft splash of fish beneath the surface, the distant calls of migrating ducks circling overhead, and the steady rustle of cattails moving with the wind. Standing on the same observation platform where my grandfather first taught me the names of birds, I sometimes close my eyes and realize the land sounds exactly as it did before all of this began. That is how I know we truly protected something worth saving. The cedar boundary post still stands where it has stood for generations, but the colorful ribbons and temporary signs disappeared long ago. In their place sits a simple wooden marker that I carved myself during the winter. The words are almost identical to the ones my grandfather painted decades earlier. Walker Marsh. Private property. Steward since 1934. I chose the word steward instead of owned because my grandfather always reminded me that land is never really ours forever. We simply take care of it until it is someone else's turn. That lesson means more to me now than ever before. Willow Creek Estates looks different these days as well. The community removed every brochure, trail map, and promotional image suggesting the marsh belonged to the neighborhood. New residents receive accurate property information when they move in, and community events now stay within the association's actual common areas. Surprisingly, several families reached out to me over the months that followed. Many apologized because they genuinely believed they had been participating in approved activities. A few even volunteered during spring cleanup projects, helping remove invasive plants along the legal boundary while learning about wetland conservation from local experts. Those conversations reminded me that misinformation often spreads much faster than truth, but honesty has a way of lasting much longer once people are finally given the chance to see it. Daniel Brooks still stops by every few months, usually carrying coffee and asking whether the migration numbers look promising for the season. We rarely talk about the dispute anymore. Instead, we count birds, compare weather patterns, and laugh about how my grandfather somehow predicted nearly everything years before it happened. Sometimes I bring out the old lockbox and read his handwritten notes again. The paper has grown softer with age, but every sentence feels just as steady as the day he wrote it. Looking back, I realized the greatest inheritance he left me was never measured in acres. It was patience. It was preparation. It was the understanding that protecting something valuable does not always require the loudest voice in the room. It requires knowing the truth well enough to let it stand on its own. Every small detail he preserved became another stone in the foundation that protected this place long after he was gone. The original survey, the weathered cedar marker, the journals filled with careful observations, the conservation agreements, even the old key hanging beside the mudroom door all pointed toward the same simple lesson. Nothing important survives by accident. It survives because someone cared enough to preserve it before anyone else realized it might one day be challenged. As the last light of another autumn evening settles across the water and another flock of ducks disappears beyond the horizon, I find myself smiling at the promise my grandfather asked me to make. I kept the marsh exactly where it belonged, not by shouting louder than anyone else, but by remembering every inch of it by heart, just as he always said I should.